This is Trad Lab. I'm Cody Greenwood, and today we're going to nerd out on broadheads. Over the last several months, I've been analyzing broadheads, and I record a few key measures. This instrument helps me record push force as I push down on the standard media and record the data. You can see that little strand inside this fixture. It's pretty common in the knife world. This gives us the ability to kind of create a standard measure of edge versus just saying scary sharp. And of course, I was taking this measure at the middle of the head. I lower this down, I make the cut, and I record the data, and then I would do a repeat to make sure I didn't have variation. And inadvertently, I'd kind of distorted my own data because later, at some point, I started cutting to the rear of the broadhead and to the point of the broadhead, and I found that I didn't have equal edge quality throughout the entire full length of the broadhead. I call that sweet spots, having sweet spots in the blade. And I went back and looked at broadheads that I had used last year, and sure enough, they had sweet spots. I didn't have equal quality from back to front. And what I want to cover today isn't the broadhead analysis itself, but how the broadhead analysis inadvertently taught me how to sharpen heads at a higher level and bring a quality edge from front to back in low cost and high end broadheads. Being able to sharpen your own broadheads is important for several reasons. But for me, the most important is having the ability to shoot my broadheads and not worry about dulling them. It's important for me to shoot my broadheads because depending on the length of the broadhead, it will change my sight picture. Also, the broadhead can either change my tune or expose what I thought was a good tune and expose it as a bad tune. And I need to be able to sort that out early prior to season and get my arrows dialed in with the broadheads on them. This is very important because it's not uncommon to see up to 8 feet per second variation at 45 yards when I'm comparing field point speed to broadhead speed. That means that arrow is working a lot harder to stabilize these, and we know that arrow flight's everything. So really refining your tune with your broadhead on there makes all of this worthwhile. The second reason why I like to be able to sharpen my own heads and multiple heads is it doesn't trap me into using one specific head. I can shoot 3 blades using this fixture. It allows me to sharpen them. I'll show you the procedure that I follow to sharpen single bevel, what I do to sharpen double bevel, and then even to take these bleeders using these jaws with the KME and refining the edge on the bleeders and reusing them. That allows me to shoot any broadhead, and I can choose the broadhead that I prefer, and I'm not trapped into using a head that comes sharp. Finally, you really can't buy your way out of this. This is a skill set you have to have. You look at these high-end iron wheels, and it comes out of the box razor sharp, and the bevels are cut perfect. The bleeders are just as sharp as the main blades, and as long as you take this right out of the box, take it straight to the field and don't shoot it, you're going to have a max edge. But the reality is, just like this broadhead, which I purchased last year and I haven't shot it at all or used it, over time, corrosion will dull almost any broadhead, and you need to have the ability to match that bevel and refine it. You're not really taking any material away, you're just polishing it. Different problem statement, but when you go with low-cost heads, they often come with different shaped bevels, and you need to be able to choose, you're kind of forced to choose the lowest bevel, match it on both sides, and cut that custom bevel, or regrind it completely to put a utility bevel on your low-cost heads so they have a little bit more retention whenever they're hitting hard items. But being able to shoot my broadheads, custom cut my bevels, and maintain my broadheads make all of this worthwhile. First step in the sharpening process is cutting the bevel equally from back to front and from the top of the bevel to the bottom of the edge. It's very, very important to match that on both sides of the broadhead. You don't want a bevel that's crooked. So whenever you're pulling these out of the box, if you have one side that has a lower angle, you're forced to either match that low side or completely regrind that broadhead to put a utility bevel on. I'm really lucky. The No Mercies that came out of the package here have a bevel that I prefer. They gave me a pretty high bevel that's what I prefer for a utility blade. I take the old permanent marker trick, mark it from back to front, and I ensure that I can see where I'm going to be cutting. You just mark that with your permanent marker, draw it across your stone a few times. A few key things that you have to do here: minimize variation, and you have to control pressure. The jig takes care of the majority of the variation. With the KME jig, it can expand. That's a different angle than when it's compressed. So I have to manage that as I'm drawing this broadhead across the stone. I'll typically compress that with my hand and maintain that. Another thing I do to reduce variation is I use what I call an anchor point. We're archers here, we all know what that is. I take the back of the broadhead and I typically always match it to the back of that fixture to ensure that I have the exact same angle every time. You mark this with your pen, you run it a few times, you see where you're hitting it, and if you're low or you're high with the KME, you make adjustments with this screw and you slide this fixture forward or back, and that changes the angle to match what you want or what you have. So whether we're cutting or polishing later, the next step, you always have to mitigate variation by pulling that jig in, letting the jig do the work, and you have to manage pressure. As I said earlier, I was creating sweet spots in my head. One of the main things that caused that was that I would just play pressure in the middle of this jig, and I assume that I'm getting the equal grind from back to front. That's not the case at all. KME actually shows this on their website. You need to apply pressure to the back of the head and draw it, cut your head, and then you need to apply pressure to the tip. Whenever I'm working on the tip, I typically use my left hand for drawing and my right hand for downward pressure. Later when this gets sharp, it'll bite me if I slip, so I use this method, and I'm drawing it. And I alternate that pressure from the back, the middle. Knowing that I bias the middle, I'll spend more time on the ends. It's harder for me to get the tip sharp. And I keep cutting that bevel until there's no ink showing. And I'll double check it. I'll mark it again. I'll give it a few licks. But if it's cut equal from back to front and top to bottom like this one is, that ink will come off really fast, as this did. This other bevel hasn't been cut yet, and it will require a lot more work. It even sounds different. So I'll put pressure here on both ends, show you what it looks like. I still have a lot of ink on this. I have a lot of cutting to do. So there's the cut bevel, and there's the one I've got to work on. Let me show you what that looks like under the microscope. So here you have an out-of-the-box Zwicky. All I've done is mark it with a marker. You can see some of the red there. We'll follow this. And again, I like the angle that they've used here. They've given me a pretty good utility angle, but I've got to refine this. Get this dialed in a bit. And I want you to see this joint. This is very, very important because the biggest mistake I make is not cutting that laminate down. Your stone will ride on the top of that laminate and never touch the bottom of your edge. So it's important when you're in this cutting process that you cut that bevel or that laminate down so you have one smooth continuous bevel from back to front and top to bottom. Take it all the way out to the tip here. You can see I've got some work to do. Here's a head that's been cut. Still have a lot of polishing work to do here, but this bevel's cut and it's at equal angle from back to front and top to bottom. Go up here and show you this joint. That's what you're looking for. You really want to manage that laminated joint and get that cut from top to bottom. I made this mistake and I had dull points here, and it's because I didn't spend enough time cutting. Take that all the way out to the tip, and you can see I have a nice straight line there. It's because my bevel is cut perfectly from back to front, top to bottom. And you have to match both sides. If I were going to choose just one stone, I would choose this 120 micron DMT DiaSharp stone. It cuts really, really fast, and removing material is what takes all the time. If you make the mistake of moving to your medium grit stones before you're done cutting, it's going to take you forever. And I used to make that mistake all the time. So fast recap, you control variation, you spread the pressure and make sure you have equal pressure across the full length of the edge, and you cut that bevel from back to front and top to bottom equally on both sides. Your trigger for knowing when to move from cutting to polishing is whenever you mark this and you take a few swipes and it takes all the ink off in 1 or 2 passes. Then you know that you're making full contact with your full bevel on your stone. At that point, you want to get rid of these cutting stones because they're removing material, and that shortens the life of your broadhead. The second step of the process is what I refer to as polishing. You're only here if you have a cut bevel on both sides of your broadhead that's of equal angle and depth from back to front and top to bottom. At this point, you're moving from your really coarse to, I'm moving from 120 micron to a coarse stone as labeled by DMT. The goal here is to polish this bevel from back to front equally and top to bottom equally to the level that each grit stone will allow. I'm also raising a burr. When I say raising a burr, and the same things hold constant for cutting, for polishing, I have to minimize variation and I have to control my pressure from each side of the broadhead, the tip, the middle, and the back. But as I draw this across this stone, I'll raise a burr. And one big mistake that I can make really easy is mistaking the burr for an actual edge. And if you feel this from right to left, it feels like I have a sharp head. If you feel this from left to right, it feels like I have a sharp head. If I feel this from right to left, the head feels dull. And that's because I'm feeling the burr raised on the offside. Do this a bit more so it's a little bit more pronounced. And what I'm trying to achieve here is I'm trying to get the burr full length from back to front of the blade facing one direction. So there's 2 elements I'm fulfilling in this step. I'm creating a polish that each grit will give me, and I'm managing that burr back and forth. As soon as you have an equal polish from back to front, for example, this coarse stone, and I have the burr raised, and I've done that on both sides, that's my trigger to move to a finer stone. And you work your way down to the polishing process until you're no longer chasing the burr and you come down to the apex of the blade. And that's your trigger to leave that polishing stage and move to the finishing stage. I've shown you how to feel it with your fingers. Let me show you what it looks like here. This is a different broadhead, but I've intentionally raised the burr on this side so you can see what that looks like. It's very easy to see. Get it focused in here. And I have it full length of the blade. The other side of the blade looks very different. You can see it's certainly not sharp. When I say top to bottom, see the bottom of that edge, how it's not been touched? This thing needs more work. But the burr is certainly not on this side, except for right there. This microscope. I tell you, I'm not into selling microscopes, and I don't think you need one for sharpening, but it is helpful because I can't detect that with my finger. There's that joint that I've cut really well. And for the most part, I've got my burr raised to this side. And that just looks like a folded up piece of metal on one side. The mistake that you make, once again, is mistaking that burr for an edge, because it is not. It'll feel sharp, but the moment that hits anything with any resistance, that burr will just fold over and you'll have an instantly dull broadhead. And it's very tricky because you can actually, yeah, I'm shaving hair with that burr. Now, you know I've only touched this with an extremely cutting stone, 120 micron and coarse, so I'm nowhere near sharp, but I'm shaving hair. That's scary sharp. I'd be scared to shave my face with that. And if you hit anything with that thin little piece of metal is going to fold over and you're going to have a really dull head. So you don't want to mistake the burr for the edge. In recap, for this process, each stone will give you a certain level of polish. You want to achieve that polish from back to front, top to bottom, and on both sides, and you want to work the burr from one side to the other. You progress from your coarse stones to your more fine stones, following that exact same procedure, polishing and chasing the burr, and you'll eventually be done. You know to move the next stone when you achieve the polish. You'll be done with your fine stones whenever that burr is gone and you can no longer feel it and you're to the apex of your blade. And that's your trigger to move from polishing to finishing. All right, let's cover the differences in these procedures with single bevels. There's really only one. I can get single bevel just as sharp as double bevel blades, but there's a slight difference, and it comes in step 2 of the process when you're managing the burr. I guess also step 1 when you're cutting, because the first thing that I do is I'll place a single bevel. Let me tighten this up so stone doesn't walk around on me. I'll place the flat portion of that single bevel blade flush against the stone, and I work it back and forth. I think I learned this from somebody on Leatherwall years ago. But if I do this, especially on the lower cost single bevels, it gets rid of all the high spots. Cutthroats aren't too bad at all. And you can see it wears the finish off your broadhead and it makes it look ugly. And I don't really care about the high spots way up here. I'm talking about on this bevel. Sometimes you get varying thicknesses, some of the cheaper single bevels, and I'll just do this to get that really perfectly straight. The fundamental difference is the burr. You do have to raise a burr on this, but you don't just flip it over in the KME and create a bevel back here. You lay this flat, and you can do this while it's in the KME fixture, and you move it back and forth until you wear that burr off. It's the exact same thing as the cutting process, and whenever you have that burr worn off, and you flip it to the other side, and you keep finishing. Obviously, you would do it with a KME. That's the only difference between double bevel and single bevel. If you wanted to, you can always put a micro bevel on the back of this, but that's not a true single bevel. If I can't achieve a really sharp edge with a single bevel, it only takes a few licks in the KME fixture to create a little micro bevel there to get me where I need to be. That's the only difference between double and single bevel. Let's talk about 3 blades. I'm really excited about this because until I got this product, I didn't have the capability to sharpen these well enough to even test them. And I couldn't include them in my broadhead test. Stay Sharp has come up with this fixture that you literally just slide sandpaper in, and he'll send you the different grit of sandpaper that you need. He sends you this little doohickey here that you place your broadhead in that prevents you from cutting yourself, which is a really smart idea. And he gives you directions, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because he's done such a good job. You point your camera at this on your smartphone, and it takes you to a YouTube video that Ron has put together that will walk you through how to use this. He also provides you with some finishing compound. But the only difference in the three blade process is literally this jig or this fixture. You're still going to cut, you're still going to polish and raise a burr, and with 3 blade you just rotate it, and you're still going to finish. You just use this curved fixture and you change out your sandpaper. Your trigger to change is the exact same. You raise a burr and you work that burr down and you move to finishing. The final step of the sharpening process, for me at least, is what I call finishing. Now in this case, I trap the sandpaper over a stone in this fixture. It's a lot cheaper than having 10,000 stones. You can wash the sandpaper, kind of clean it off, and reuse it several times, and that really presents a lot of value. And everything stays constant. I have to minimize variation, and I have to control the pressure from the front, and the tip, the middle, and the back. It's a good idea whenever you go from step to step to check your anchor. Make sure this thing hasn't slipped. If it has, you just tighten it up. So at this point, I'm going to work this edge and follow the exact same procedure. I'm moving pressure around. I have to be really careful because this thing will bite me at this point. I'm not having to really push hard from one end to the other, and it is very sharp at this point. I mean, it'll take hair off easily at this point. This is very sharp. You can see the hair that comes off there. It's not hair popping yet, but it's almost there. In terms of grit, you're going to be around 800 or 1,000 grit in my mind whenever you're in the finishing stage. Depending on the quality of steel, I'll go up to 3,000 or 5,000 grit sandpaper in my finishing process, but you may not see that maximize edge retention. Depending on the steel, you'll stop getting a better edge. But what I have found is that creating a mirror polish up here by going up to 5000K sandpaper, and then all the way down to 3 micron paste stropping, I get a mirror finish. And a mirror finish combined with this Century Tough Glide oil makes it more resistant to corrosion. I don't know why. I'm not a metal specialist, but there's no doubt in my mind when I polish these and I have a mirror polish, they corrode slower and they don't become as dull as quick. Because after you get this finished, if you're not using it, it'll still get dull, as we discussed earlier. You just have to maintain that with some stropping. All right, at this point, we should be able to see an equal level of polish from back to front and from top to bottom. And whenever you see that, flip it over, you achieve it on the other side, and you're ready to go, just like the polishing process, to a finer grit. In this case, I'll go from sandpaper to actual stropping blocks. I have a 6 micron and a 3 micron here, and I use this paste. I'll put a little bit on there, treat the leather, and I don't put it on every time, just I'll treat the leather whenever I feel like I need it. And I'll start obviously with the higher micron, and I start the stropping process. What's important about the stropping process, you have to add an element in terms of maintaining and controlling variation. The leather obviously has more give than the stone. So if I'm pushing down, like I told you before, 6 pounds on my really coarse, roughly 8 pounds of pressure on my medium to fine stones, when I get to this, it's like 3 pounds. I've never actually measured stropping, but I'm assuming it's around 3 pounds because I don't want to compress that leather, because what that will ultimately do is it'll change the angle and introduce variation. And now I'm honing on an angle that I haven't been cutting from. The key to achieving maximum sharpness is maintaining that constant angle and eliminating that variation. And as you can see here, this stropping block is not as wide as my stones, so I have to work harder. I work from the back to the front. Nothing changes. I have to maintain the compression of this jig so I minimize variation, and I have to control the pressure and the distribution, and I almost cut my finger there, as I move across this bevel. And you know when to move forward, again, when you've created another level of mirror polish here, and you have it from front to back and top to bottom. But I'm achieving a pretty good polish on this edge. I could see writing. If I put writing next to this edge, I can actually see it in the bevel, and that means I have a mirror polish. I mean, you don't even have to touch it. You know it's sharp. This thing will take hair off easy. And there's the tip taking hair off, which is the hardest for me to achieve. And there's the back taking hair off, and it's coming off with ease. Running out of hair on my arms. My wife's going to kill me. From that point, I move from 6 to 3 micron, follow the exact same process. At this point, you have a finished head. I treat it with the Century oil, rub it in really well, let it dry because it does have a chemical smell, and I put it in storage. But that's ready to hunt. All right, let's talk about bleeders. Bleeders often get overlooked because they're hard to sharpen. I didn't even know I had the option to sharpen these with KMEs until a few months ago. I got corrected online. I was glad to find this, but KME offers different jaws. You've got this set, which is what I typically use for broadheads. You have this set that's a bit more narrow, and you have this set that's extremely narrow. And that allows you to take the thinnest and smallest of blades and sharpen them and bring them to the same level of sharpness that your main blade has. It's very important because bleeders create resistance and require push force, so you have to manage this. It's the exact same process. You're going to cut the bevel if it requires it, you're going to polish it, and you're going to finish it. The only difference is you're using a slightly different, as you can see by the bevel under the microscope, we're at the end of the video. We have a mirror polish. It's hair popping sharp, or you can shave your face with it. I've taken it to its max edge. It's treated and it's ready to go into storage and be used for hunting. In this video, I've covered double bevel, single bevel, 3-blade, and bleeders. I've covered some of the common mistakes that I've made, and I've covered the key triggers to move from one step in the process to the next. Hopefully this adds value.